Hello people, and welcome back to another Cities Skylines tier video. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to have a look at all the status effect unique buildings, and what I mean by that is all of the unique buildings, including monuments and campus buildings, that directly provide a buff to the city. So I'm excluding all unique buildings that don't have one of these buffs, as that list would be immensely long and really kind of subjective as to what the asset looks to, as to where it falls on a tier list like this. Of course, these are all based on my own personal experience playing this game and dropping these buildings in, and some of these buffs will affect different cities quite dramatically depending on what types of zonings that you do and don't have within your cities. But otherwise, this should be quite a fun one. Let's get started with the unique buildings tier list, shall we? So first up on the unique buildings tier list is the Castle of Lord Chirpwick, and this for me falls into a strong A tier unique. So the Castle of Lord Chirpwick is actually the monument that comes with the Part Life DLC and is actually the most expensive monument to place at 1.9 million, but also the cheapest upkeep at 3200. Alongside being one of the better looking monuments, it also increases the attractiveness of all unique buildings in the city by 25%, which on its own doesn't really sound that important, but once you start to look at where your unique buildings are placed, especially in and around downtown areas where you tend to have lots of them clustered, this 25% will soon start to add up, driving many more sims through your public transport networks and indeed part life cheeses if you use them in your city. And I think we can all agree that the Castle of Lord Chirpwick, when used correctly in the right place, is one of the best looking things you can add to your city. It can be quite hard to use on occasion just because it has like a very deep stone base, and if it's not used correctly it can stand out like a sore thumb, but taking some care and attention with it can really pull off. And that 25% buff to the attractiveness of all your unique buildings isn't something to be overlooked. Probably not a must-place building compared to some of the other ones on this list, and just because of the fact it can be quite hard to integrate into certain cities, the Castle Lord Chirpwick falls as a very strong A tier unique for me. Next up is the City Arch unique building, and this for me falls into a fairly underwhelming C tier. So the City Arch comes with the Part Life DLC. Whilst it is quite a nice looking unique and can certainly help frame main roads into important areas such as a nice entrance into your downtown, the buff it provides is a 5% increase in capacity for tourists entering your city via the roads. So that is not including tourists that arrive via planes, intercity buses, trains or cruise liners. It is only the tourists that are coming in via the roads. Whilst any sort of buff to tourism numbers is fine and it will earn you more money, especially in your leisure areas, it's such a small buff that you won't really notice a massive difference in your city. If you do want to come in and have a look at analytics once it's placed, you can check your tourism tab and see the purple sims entering into the city via the roads. This will increase by 5% with the City Arch down. Probably not the worst unique building by any means, but definitely no higher than C tier either. Next up is the Clock Tower, again from the Part Life DLC. And this to me falls into a middle of the road B tier unique. So again, as with most of the status effect uniques, they come with the Part Life DLC. The Clock Tower, even though it is one of the best looking uniques in the game, it works anywhere, especially as kind of an eye-drawing town centre asset. Its buff is incredibly random. It will increase the speed of your trains by 20%. I guess if you have busy train platforms, the increased speed will mean that trains frequent that station 20% more often. You shouldn't really be relying on a unique building to fix that problem. It's usually a case of you need a more efficient train network, or indeed supporting the train line with additional methods of public transport, which you should be doing as you build a city anyway. The increase in train speed also means that trains are much more likely and frequently to meet at junctions, which for poorly set up rail networks can lead to train traffic jams a lot more frequently. But otherwise, enjoy a comparison of how fast the trains move with and without the clock tower in the city. Kind of a random buff. I guess it could be helpful in very specific scenarios, but definitely the aesthetics of this building bring it higher up than it probably should fall on this list. Middle of the road B tier for me. Hey guys, if you're enjoying the video, just a quick plug for my instant gaming link down below. I'm an official instant gaming partner and you can find all your favourite Cities Skylines DLCs alongside tons of other games as well. Using my link does directly support me, so thank you so much. It's really worth checking out, and you get something cool in return for your support. So let's get back to the tier list. Next up is the Doomsday Vault monument from the Natural Disasters DLC, and this falls into the first Building Cheeks, unique. So the Doomsday Vault is only going to apply in your city if you are playing with natural disasters on, and it will increase the efficiency of your disaster shelters by allowing them to stockpile more food and water, and also raises their holding capacity as well. Whilst the building itself does look pretty cool, again, similar to the castle, it has to be used in the correct area, otherwise it will stand out like a sore thumb. So if you're playing with natural disasters on and you're finding that you don't have enough space in your shelters, and indeed your shelters are running out of their resources to keep the Sims alive whilst the disaster happens, then it can help you with that problem. And I think with the vast majority of us not particularly playing with natural disasters on in our main cities anyway, especially to the point where you actually unlock the monuments if you're moving through the milestones. And if you're having trouble holding enough Sims in your shelters and are also not really holding enough of the resources to keep those Sims alive, then the Doomsday Vault can help with that. But away from that situation, it's kind of useless. So for me and for my gameplay style, it's very much a Building Cheeks unique. Next up is the Eden Project, and this falls into an absolute must place. So the Eden Project is easily one of the more powerful uniques in the game. Not only does it reduce pollution citywide, both ground and water, it also massively buffs the land value across the entire city. How big this buff is will depend on how high your land value already is. If you have a lot of parks and you need clustered to have already pretty high land value, then the Eden Project is only going to buff it further. And you can see just how much of a difference it makes with the land value heat map over the city, both with and without the Eden Project in the map. It also looks insanely cool, pairs very nicely with green cities and also some of the high-tech content creator buildings, and you can make some very unique builds out of this thing. As soon as you get to the point where you can place it, you absolutely should, because with the higher land value, you're able to charge more tax, which of course means more income for your city. Eden Project is a must place as soon as you can. So there's also a little kind of tag on here for the Eden Project unique. This building is both a blessing and a curse, as you can see from the screen right now. So placing the Eden Project will cause you to suffer probably your biggest ever death wave. It's insane. Palaven has currently lost 20,000 Sims. The reason this happens is because the land values under the global buildings will be so insanely high that nearly every single building in your city will reach maximum level in a couple of seconds. Which is great because that brings you more tax revenue, more tourism and new citizens. But the downside of this is that massive influx of population, the equivalent of zoning in kind of an enormous batch of high density residential all at once. And because the birth rate, influx and death rates are related to each other, when the spike of influx occurs, you can also expect the same spikes in the birth and the death rates as well. So if after placing the Eden Project, after a couple of in-game years, you start to suffer an enormous death wave, that is why the Eden Project has caused basically your entire city to level up, which brings in thousands of new Sims, and then they all die at the same time. So Eden Project can be a double-edged sword, just be careful with it. Next up is the Fusion Power Plant Monument, and this for me falls into B tier unique. So the Fusion Power Plant does exactly that. It functions as a power plant and produces 16,000 megawatts of power, which is absolutely enormous. In my vanilla city Palaven of 90,000 people, my electricity consumption is only 830 megawatts. Of course, you can just place this thing down, remove all of the power plants, and then lower your electricity budget down to bring down the power production as well. But even the largest cities, even towards 500,000 population, if you do manage to reach that high, will still never use the full output of the Fusion Power Plant. It is also an incredibly distinct and unique looking building, making it quite hard to integrate into a regular looking city. But if you do appreciate the quirky aesthetics of this thing and the immense power output, it's probably worth placing down. But I believe the vast majority of our cities won't ever get the use of the full 16,000 megawatts that this thing produces. It does, however, have an 8,000 per week upkeep cost, which is the same as the nuclear plant, but the fusion power plant has essentially 20 times the output of the nuclear plant anyway. So it's really a trade-off. If you can deal with the very quirky aesthetic of this building, and indeed can find a use for the immense power output, then you can probably place it. but otherwise it's middle of the road for me. Next up on the unique building tier list is the Hadron Collider monument, and this for me falls again into a B tier. So where this falls on a tier list for you will kind of depend on what you think of its buff. The Hadron Collider will provide 1 million education spaces for all levels of education, so that's elementary, high school and university. However, as of a recent patch, you can actually exclude the buff to university education, purely because having the Hadron Collider around alongside any sort of campus area will make it nearly impossible for your campuses to hit level 5. So it essentially makes all schools in the city obsolete because you get 1 million of each space. Of course, you can still keep schools placed around your city, but you'll just be having enormous amounts of education availability, which isn't a bad thing, but you'll certainly never hit the cap. This thing also looks pretty cool as well. Again, it's kind of leaning into the futuristic side alongside the fusion power plant and the Eden project. Definitely not one of the most garish buildings you're ever likely to see, and can certainly be factored into some certain builds. I have actually used this before in a space center build, so it definitely has a place within the game. But if you do need a buff of 1 million to all of your education types, then the Hadron Collider can do that. How useful that is kind of up to you, but for me, it's a middle of the road B tier unique. Next up on the unique buildings tier list is the medical center monument, and this for me falls into building bum cheeks. So the medical center is a cyberpunk's wet dream. This thing has a super dystopian style to it and clashes with every other building in the game. I have never seen this thing organically or naturally integrated into a city unless it's kind of heavily modded and lots of assets to get that kind of cyberpunk feel. It serves as kind of a double hospital, really. It has 1,000 hospital spaces or patient capacity compared to the regular hospitals, which are 500. And it also has a distribution count of 50 ambulances, which again, compared to the regular hospitals, is just about double. It does also have a helicopter pad that will accept your medical helicopters. But just because the healthcare mechanic in cities isn't massively fleshed out, you never really have a problem with Sims getting sick, and hospitals and clinics are essentially just parks that boost land value and happiness in the area. If you are getting lots of sick Sims, it's usually because there's a big pollution source either messing with the water or too close to residentials. So to have a monument that's basically just 2 hospitals and has this kind of insane design to it, it's not for me. So for those reasons, it very much falls into building cheeks for the medical center. Next up is the observation tower, which in this thumbnail here looks more like the observation candlestick. And this is going to go into a healthy A tier unique. So the observation tower comes with the Park Life DLC, and it will provide a 10% buff to the radius of all parks in the city, which is quite nice. That will stack up, especially when you start using lots of parks around. The building can be quite hard to place just because of its extremely unique style, but works really nicely as part of your main skyline, or indeed in and around waterfronts as some kind of waterfront attraction. So its buff isn't the most powerful thing ever, but a 10% buff to all park areas is quite nice, and if you can find a good place to squeeze it in, then it's certainly worth placing in your city. Next up is the Old Market Street unique, and this for me just about qualifies as an A tier unique. So when placed, the Old Market Street asset will give a 5% increase to the income from the commercial areas within its radius, which means that if you're not placing this near commercial, you won't see the benefit of the unique. It does not apply citywide. And if you're also playing without the European theme or in a map that isn't European theme, then it does stand out pretty harshly. But with those are the downsides, a 5% buff to commercial income, especially if it's in a very dense commercial area, is always nice. That's going to mean more tax for you. And it's also a really nice looking asset as well. It has a little path through the middle with lots of little market stands in it and can be used in a variety of ways, especially in kind of an old quarter district if that's what you're looking to build. So certainly not a pointless buff, but again, has to be placed in the right place for that buff to apply. Nice looking asset. It's just about an A tier for me. Definitely worth placing once you have it unlocked. Next up, we will move into the campus unique buildings. So of course, all of these will increase the campus attractiveness. That's a given with any campus building, so not really going to factor that into the ranking. And the first one is the Police Academy, and this for me falls into a C tier unique. So whilst I do love the aesthetic of the Police Academy, I'm not going to try and focus too much on this here. When placed within your trade school campus areas, it will increase jail cell capacity, patrol car quantity, and how quickly the police will get around your city to collect crime citywide. It will buff all current existing police stations. For example, a regular police station will go from holding 20 criminals to 26, so it's a very small buff, and to be honest, I've never really suffered major crime problems in the city. It's kind of similar to healthcare. It's not a massively fleshed out mechanic in the game. It's really just there as a service asset to keep Sims happy and provide land value. So to buff those with one of the campus uniques, it's okay if you need the extra police capacity without having to place more police stations to get that coverage, then the police academy can help with that. But otherwise, the buff isn't massively useful. Building does look great and can definitely work outside of your campus areas as well, as a lot of these campus uniques can, especially in and around downtowns. But trying to focus on its buff, it's C tier for me. Next up is the School of Economics from the Liberal Arts campus type, and this for me goes into a must place. So when placed within the city, the School of Economics will buff the income of all office zoning, that's regular and IT cluster, by what I can tell from my testing, by about 10%. Of course, this buff will continue to massively help depending on how much office zoning you have, but I think most of us, especially towards the end of our cities, have pretty significant amounts of office zoning, all of which is going to start producing around 10% more cash due to the School of Economics. Very handy to have indeed. And like always, these campus buildings look fantastic in and around downtowns, super large, important looking things. Definitely be placing this if you're setting up a liberal arts college. You will definitely notice a difference in your income. Next up is the School of Education from the Liberal Arts College, and this for me falls into a middle of the road B tier. So when placed within the city, the School of Education will increase the capacity of all elementary and high schools by about 30%. That's a pretty significant increase, but again, how useful that is to you depends if you're struggling for school space within your city. And also worth mentioning that if you have the Hadron Collider in the city at the same time, it essentially makes this unique building in particular pretty useless. It does, however, look quite nice, and a 30% increase is definitely one of the larger increases that we've seen in this list so far. So middle of the road, worth placing, not the most amazing buff, and can be made obsolete by the Hadron Collider. B tier for me. Next up is the School of Engineering from the Trade School campus. This for me falls into a must place. So the School of Engineering, when placed within the city, will increase the income from all generic zoned industry, so that's not including any industrial DLC areas, by about 5% from my testing. Of course, you might get more mileage out of your city depending on how much industry you have, but it's about 5%. And it also reduces the strain on all of your water and sewage outlets, meaning you have to place less of them, which is always a good thing, because if you don't have the Sunset Harbour DLC, some of those assets can be relatively pollutive. And it just means you'll also pay less upkeep on one of the more essential services in the city, like water. So a nice buff to an essential service, and also a buff to a very common type of zone in generic industry. School of Engineering looks fantastic as well. Definitely place this thing in your downtown. Good building, really helpful buffs. It's a must place for me. Next up is the School of Environmental Studies from the Liberal Arts campus, and this for me falls into a relatively healthy B tier. So alongside being another super cool looking important asset that you can use pretty much anywhere in your city, as long as it's within a campus area of course, the School of Environmental Studies will slightly reduce the garbage accumulation in your city, which again is another nice buff to an essential service, not quite as good as the water one and the generic industry increase that the School of Engineering provides, but it's probably on par with the School of Education's school capacity buff. It doesn't do anything else besides that slightly accused garbage accumulation. You could also partner this with some of the garbage reducing policies to further extend that garbage accumulation buff, but otherwise it's definitely not the best buff you'd like to see, but certainly not the most useless either. So it's the middle of the road B tier for me. Next up is the School of Law from the University campus type. And this to me goes into a very strong A tier unique. So when placed in the city, the School of Law will provide a citywide police department upkeep reduction. From my testing, this seems to be about 25%, and it will also reduce the crime rate. Again, in my city, it reduced it by about 1%, which isn't the best crime rate buff, but again, that will depend exactly on how many police stations you have currently monitoring that crime rate. But a fantastic looking building, looks amazing in downtowns, super important looking. So probably not up there with some of the best buffs, but definitely one of the better ones. Strong A tier unique for me. Next up is the School of Medicine from the University campus area. This to me falls into kind of an underwhelming C tier alongside the Police Academy. So when the School of Medicine is placed within your city, it will increase all healthcare efficiency, increase the capacity of all hospitals and clinics, and also bring up the number of available ambulances. Like we discussed with the Medical Centre Monument, healthcare just isn't really that much of a fleshed out or important mechanic in the game. Sims just don't get sick, so buffing the assets that deal with that isn't massively important. From my testing, the increase seems to be about 15%. Regular hospitals go from 500 to 575 capacity, but I don't think there's anyone playing cities that's really struggling for hospital space. It is a nice looking building which keeps it out of building cheeks, and I guess a 15% buff to all healthcare and ambulance numbers isn't that bad. It's just not that useful, so it's kind of a C tier building for me. Next up is the School of Science from the University campus area, and this to me falls into a must place. So the School of Science, once it has been placed within your university area, will increase the income from all specialised industry. This is the vanilla specialisation. This does not count towards the Industries DLC. As far as I can tell from my testing, it doesn't affect Industries DLC, just the base game specialised stuff. It will also reduce your electricity consumption citywide, again from my testing, by about 8%, and it will also reduce citywide pollution, both ground and water. Extremely useful unique building. It buffs income from industry, reduces electricity consumption, and reduces pollution. Buffs two really important key services for the city, alongside giving you more tax income from specialised industry at least. It's a shame it doesn't affect the Industries DLC, but I think a lot of us still use the base game industries with the Industries DLC too, so you're going to see a slight increase in tax, plus the money saved from the services buffs as well. So School of Science, alongside it being a fantastic looking asset, is also a very useful one. Definitely be placing this as soon as you can. Next up, we have the last of the campus uniques, and this is the School of Tourism and Travel. And this, again, is going to fall into a must place. So once the School of Tourism and Travel is in your city, it is going to increase the attractiveness and entertainment values of all your leisure buildings, which is great by itself. That's going to draw more tourists to these types of areas. But it also boosts the income from all commercial areas. And in my case, with my testing, this was an increase of 17%, which is amazing. That is so much extra money from just one building. And especially considering that commercial income, at least in my case and most of my cities, is the second highest earner behind residential. Having placed the School of Tourism and Travel, you will notice a lot more commercial tax income. So certainly a must place unique in my opinion. Next up is the Sea Fortress unique building, which is going to fall into a C tier unique. So when the Sea Fortress is placed in your city, it will increase the tourist capacity of your airports and ship ports by 5%. This essentially makes it the sea and air equivalent of the City Arch, which of course buffed the tourist capacity of the roads by 5%. So it's a nice little buff, not the most amazing, certainly not a building cheeks building. If you'd like to receive 5% more tourists via your cruise liner ports and your airports, then you can place the Sea Fortress. It is a really nice looking building, definitely holds some sort of old quarter vibes like the old Market Street does, and will pair very nicely with a European themed waterfront. But it does exactly the same as the City Arch, so for that reason it's going to fall into C tier. Next up is the Space Elevator, which is another monument. Aesthetic Egg wants to put this well and truly into the bum cheeks, however Cheesy Egg wants to place this into must play, but because we're focusing on the buff and the function of the unique buildings today, the Space Elevator 100% goes into must place. So the Space Elevator kind of does exactly what it says on the tin. It will elevate people essentially down from space. This thing will dump thousands of Sims into your city every single week at a constant stream, all of which are tourists that are going to come and spend money in all your commercial areas and park life cheeses. It will also force those park life cheeses, if placed in the correct way, into the tens of thousands a week. I have managed to hit about 40,000 a week with the space elevator next to a park life cheese. However, placing them in your downtown is going to force so many more people into your public transport network, which means vast amounts more money being spent in the commercial zones, on the public transport, in park life cheeses. Insanely overpowered building. There's a reason this is a monument. However, Aesthetic Egg will ask to come into play and mention that this thing looks horrendous. It will clash massively with most of your city. You can probably squeeze it into sort of a space-style centre build alongside the Hadron Collider, but outside of that, this thing is going to stand out like a sore thumb, just like the medical centre did. But if you're looking to really ramp up those cheeses, make a ton more money, there's few better options to do that than just placing the space elevator. Next up is the statue of Colossalus, which is a unique building, and this for me goes into B-tier unique. So there's not too much to say about the statue of Colossalus. There's obviously a pun on the developer's name. The thing can be extremely hard to actually integrate naturally into the city just because of the pure look of it. I don't mind it. Strong Greek vibes with this one. You also want to make sure you don't place it too high up on a cliff, otherwise it's kind of plimps become really tall. But the building itself will actually increase the stay of tourists in the city by 20%, which is a pretty heavy buff. And that essentially translates to all those tourists, especially the ones that come in via the space elevator, which we just looked at, are going to be in the city for 20% longer, which means they're going to spend 20% more cash. They're going to be hanging around park life cheeses, tourism areas, unique buildings, public transport at 20% extra time. So it's quite a nice buff, not the most amazing, definitely falls as a healthy, middle-of-the-road unique for me. And last but certainly not least is the Ultimate Recycling Centre. And this for me falls into a must place. So once the Ultimate Recycling Monument is in your city, it will do that, it will perform Ultimate Recycling. It also produces electricity, although not a vast amount, only 60 megawatts. It will make goods and raw materials which can be used in your city to be sold or indeed exported for further cash, and it also has a 100 garbage truck capacity as well. Comparing them to the Sunset Harbour assets, which I think the vast majority of us use for processing garbage at this point in the game's life cycle, the Sunset Harbour assets have 15 trucks compared to 100, and they will process 192,000 units of garbage a week, which compared to the Ultimate Recycling Centre, which will process 800,000 units of garbage a week. So it's going to process vast amounts of garbage compared to the waste transfer complexes. Going to give you a little bit of power, which isn't a vast amount, but every little helps. And it's also going to produce goods that can be sold in the city and exported as well. It's probably worth bringing your garbage budget down once you have actually placed this thing, because even the largest cities will not need 800,000 units of garbage processing a week. So you can save yourself a little bit on the upkeep because it is quite an expensive building to maintain at 8,000 a week. So you can afford to bring that budget down and still have enough headroom. Besides its great functionality, it's also a really good looking industrial building and will settle into a variety of your industrial builds wherever you choose to place this thing. Of course, always consider its orientation, but for me, the Ultimate Recycling Plant is definitely a must place unique in your cities. Okay guys, that is going to do it for today. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. If indeed you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, please consider leaving me a like, comment and a share below. It really helps grow my channel and bring more people to the community. Equally as much if you haven't enjoyed it, then please feel free to leave a dislike as well. I'd also be really interested in hearing your guys' experiences with the buildings we've talked about today, because there are so many variables in Cities Skylines, because a lot of these buildings buff other types of buildings. If some of us don't have as many as some others, it might kind of affect things differently. So if you think I've placed something too high or indeed too low, and you think that's an amazing unique, it should definitely be higher than C tier, for example, then do get down in the comments and let's see our experiences with the uniques. This video took a ton of time to produce, so all the support below is really appreciated. It makes these tier lists worth making. And indeed, if you have any more suggestions for Cities Skylines tier lists, please leave them in the comments below. We will definitely keep making these. Otherwise, I'll shut up and we'll leave it there. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, enjoy the rest of your day.